At a time when many expected Russia and China to remain cautious rivals, an unexpected reality has taken shape. Today, nearly 71% of Russians say they view China favorably, even though the two giants once stood on opposite sides of bitter ideological disputes and even exchanged fire along their shared border in 1969. How did two countries that clashed during the Sino-Soviet split of the 1950s-60s, drifted apart after the death of Stalin in 1953, and moved in sharply different political directions during China's 1978 economic reforms, end up forming what analysts now call the strongest Russia-China partnership in modern history? In this analysis, we trace the long arc of their relationship, from Cold War confrontations and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, to the signing of key cooperation treaties in 1996, 2001, and 2011, and finally to the unprecedented political closeness symbolized by Vladimir Putin's high-profile visit to Beijing just before Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. We'll explore why Russian society is increasingly anti-American yet pro-Chinese, how massive cross-border exchanges once reached over 1 million travelers per year, and why both nations, despite mutual suspicion rooted in history, find strategic value in standing together in a rapidly shifting global order. To understand why Russia and China, once locked in deep ideological hostility, are now moving closer than ever, we need to travel back through decades of shifting alliances, power struggles, and strategic recalculations. In the early years after the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, Moscow aligned closely with Beijing. The newly formed PRC and the Soviet Union signed the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship, Alliance, and Mutual Assistance shortly after China's birth, forming a tight bloc within the communist world. In that world, Russia, then the Soviet Union, and China were ideological siblings, united by Marxist-Leninist doctrine and a shared vision of socialist solidarity. But the alliance began to crack as early as the mid-1950s. After the death of Stalin in 1953, his successor initiated a policy of peaceful coexistence with the West, a shift that deeply worried Beijing. By the late 1950s, the Sino-Soviet split had taken root, driven by ideological divergence, national interests, and competition for leadership of the communist movement. What once looked like a monolithic communist bloc started to unravel. Tensions escalated sharply in 1969, when a bloody border clash occurred over the disputed island of Jinbao, a stark demonstration that the two socialist brothers could just as easily be enemies. Soviet border guards and Chinese troops exchanged fire. The enmity also extended beyond direct confrontation. The Soviets supplied arms to countries that Beijing viewed as adversaries, including India, which complicated China's regional ambitions. Then came the watershed moment, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. For Russia, this was more than the end of a superpower, it was a dramatic economic and political collapse. As Moscow descended into economic hardship and political uncertainty, its global standing and influence diminished. Meanwhile, China embarked on market-oriented reforms following its 1978 reform and opening up, positioning itself as the rising economic powerhouse in Asia, and soon, the world. In this new reality, both countries found something they needed. Russia needed economic revival, trade, and a partner to counterbalance a West that appeared increasingly hostile. China needed a political and military heavyweight to secure its northern flank and strengthen its global footprint. Thus began a steady thaw, first tentative, then increasingly deliberate. By 1996, the two signed the Strategic Partnership Treaty between Russia and China, a symbolic reset of bilateral relations. 5 years later, in 2001, they reinforced this with the Treaty of Good Neighborliness and Friendly Cooperation between the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation, and in 2011 upgraded their ties even further by adopting the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership of Coordination between Russia and China. Each step deepened confidence and institutional cooperation. This alliance now rests not on shared ideology but shared interests. Under Vladimir Putin and his ruling party, Russia has drifted away from the democratic ideals it once claimed to share with the West. Instead, Moscow favors strong central control over liberal freedoms, a model not unlike China. On issues such as human rights at international forums, Russia now routinely backs China's positions. This rapprochement is also reflected in public sentiment. According to a survey by the Pew Research Center, roughly 71% of Russians report a favorable view of China, whereas only 29% express similar warmth toward the United States. Against 60% unfavorable views of America, that's a significant pro-China tilt. For many Russians, China increasingly represents stability, respect, and an alternative to what they perceive as Western hypocrisy. Today, the relationship is driven not by communist solidarity but by a mutual understanding. Both nations feel directly threatened by a U.S.-led world order, and both believe the West seeks to constrain their regional ambitions. This shared worldview is what allows Moscow and Beijing to overlook old rivalries and present a united front in global politics. Russia under Vladimir Putin has shifted sharply away from its early post-Soviet experiments with Western-style democracy. Despite its constitutionally defined electoral system, modern Russia functions with strict central control, limited opposition, and heavy influence over the press. While Russia is not a copy of China's one-party system, the political climate in both countries increasingly rewards stability over freedom and order over pluralism. This shared emphasis makes cooperation easier. Neither government pressures the other on internal human rights issues, a stark contrast with the West. This alignment is especially visible at the United Nations, where Russia consistently shields China from criticism over Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and other human rights concerns. Beijing, in turn, supports Moscow whenever Western nations attempt to isolate it diplomatically. In a sense, each provides the other with political cover on the world stage, ensuring neither stands isolated in the face of Western condemnation. Still, beneath this unity lies deep asymmetry. China is the economic powerhouse. Russia, particularly since the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, has become more dependent on Chinese markets, Chinese technology, and Chinese diplomatic support. Beijing has not forgotten the humiliations of the past, the Sino-Soviet split of the 1950s, the 1969 border conflict, or the Soviet support for India and Vietnam during regional disputes. That is why China is unlikely ever to enter a formal military alliance with Russia. Beijing prefers flexibility, retaining room to maneuver if Russia's political stability weakens or if a post-Putin era shifts Moscow's orientation back toward Europe. Yet if China maintains caution, Moscow is trending in the opposite direction. Sanctions have pushed Russia to look east, relying heavily on Chinese trade routes, energy purchases, and industrial components. A Russia weakened economically but still armed with the world's second-largest military creates a paradox. Moscow needs Beijing more than Beijing needs Moscow, reversing the roles from the early Cold War. This dependency is one of the strongest forces locking the two countries together today. Cross-border movements symbolized the depth of ties long before COVID-19 and the Ukraine war disrupted travel. Between 2017 and 2019, roughly 1.68 million Chinese visitors entered Russia per year, dwarfing arrivals from India or Japan. China, in turn, welcomed around 2.5 million Russian visitors annually, placing Russia on par with major Western tourist sources. These flows demonstrate how cultural curiosity and economic opportunity knit the two societies together in ways often overlooked in traditional geopolitical analysis. Russia's population of around 144 million has its own pressures. A sex ratio skewed toward women, partly due to military conscription, partly due to male health problems such as heavy alcohol use, creates social dynamics that do not exist in China. China, by contrast, faces the opposite demographic imbalance, more men than women, plus a rapidly aging population. Both countries, in different ways, are exploring ways to sustain economic vitality despite shrinking workforces, another shared challenge that subtly strengthens strategic understanding. Russia's 17.1 million square kilometers make it the world's largest country, touching nations from Norway to North Korea. Its border with China alone stretches 4,300 kilometers. This proximity is a double-edged sword. It creates opportunities for trade and cooperation, but also historical anxieties about territorial claims and migration. That is why both governments work hard to ensure today's political goodwill prevents a return to old fears, a pragmatic necessity rather than pure trust. The most important shift is the global environment itself. As the United States focuses more on domestic priorities, and as U.S.-China rivalry intensifies, both Moscow and Beijing sense a window of opportunity. They share a common goal: reshape the international system in ways that dilute American influence. Institutions like BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, G20, and APEC now serve as frequent meeting points where Russian and Chinese leaders coordinate positions, propose new global initiatives, and cultivate support from developing nations that are more sympathetic to their worldview. Furthermore, the global map of public opinion is shifting. Western nations remain overwhelmingly anti-Russia and anti-China, but many developing Asian, African, and Middle Eastern countries express favorable views toward one or both powers. This creates a multipolar world where Russia and China can build influence not through ideological conversion, but through infrastructure investment, arms sales, and political partnerships. Taken together, all these forces, strategic necessity, political convergence, economic interdependence, geopolitical rivalry with the West, and widespread public support inside Russia, explain why today's Russia-China alignment is stronger than at any time in modern history. Yet it is also fragile beneath the surface. If Russia's ruling party collapses, or if Putin steps down, the country could swing back toward Europe and the United States. Likewise, China will never forget past betrayals, and will always keep Moscow at arm's length when it comes to binding alliances. Still, for now, the partnership stands. It is not a marriage of love or ideology, but a marriage of calculation, one that reshapes global politics, challenges Western assumptions, and forces surrounding nations, especially Japan and South Korea, to rethink their security strategies.